So in the middle of looking at pop art, we looked at British pop art, and we made a start thinking about American pop art, not actually looking at the pop artists in America themselves, which is what we'll do today, but looking at a couple of artists who were quite important in kind of breaking the ground, making ready for pop art in America. So transitional figures, Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, both of whom made use of ready-made imagery in some way. So let's start looking at the first of the American recognized pop artists themselves, and that's Roy Lichtenstein. This is his big painting number 6 of 1965. You know, probably the first thing we think of when we think of pop art is high art engaging with popular art, mass imagery, mass reproduced imagery, handmade images about mass reproduced images. And I think that's true. That's the kind of core thing that goes on. But there's a lot of pop art which is art about art, high art about high art. And this image, first one we're looking at, big painting number 6 by Lichtenstein, certainly falls into that kind of category. It fits in with the idea that pop art is a reaction against abstract expressionism. The spontaneity, the personal gesture of abstract expressionism is very much in contrast with the impersonal look, the lack of a expressive dimension in pop art, the lack of a concern with interiority, a concern with things in the real world, outward extrovert orientation. So instead of providing an alternative to abstract expressionism in its subject matter, as he does in works like this, which we'll come on to in a second, in this case he's putting abstract expressionism itself into the place of the target, you know, picking a detail of what could be abstract expressionist brushwork, or generically that kind of loose expressive brushwork. So critique of what by then was a kind of dominant style, from starting off as being outsiders, the abstract expressionists, by the 1960s that was a kind of dominant style in the art market, in art schools, wherever you want to look. So you could say it's a sort of an attack on abstract expressionism, but perhaps a little bit more fair would be to say it's an attack not on abstract expressionism, but on the second wave or even third wave followers of it, people who didn't invent an idiom but who took a pre-existing idiom and kind of reduced it to a formula, you know, some kind of followers that just turned what was originally very spontaneous and individual into a kind of a trend that everyone can follow. Maybe it was at that moment that then it becomes ripe for replacement. Of course, it's not a direct engagement of one kind of high art with another kind of high art. It's engagement via an intermediary phase, which is mass reproduced imagery, and that comes across in the use of the dot-like touch. So it's kind of using that as a way of distancing from abstract expressionism, is to make it appear to be as if a reproduction of that. That also kind of references in a way its fame, I suppose, but it provides a kind of distance, or a way of bringing together a handmade image of another handmade image. How do you do that and retain a sense of distance or alienation effect, as a German playwright Sir Bertolt Brecht would say. So this, of course, becomes a characteristic stylistic mannerism of Lichtenstein, the use of a kind of a look of printed illustration. It's called the Ben-Day dot, a kind of sort of digital way of pixelated way of breaking an image down that was used in printing processes, still is today, I suppose. Bringing that to our attention. So, as well as being an image about high art, it's also an image about mass reproduction of image at the same time. So we're seeing sort of three layers, if you like: the original abstract expressionism, then the kind of printed reproduction, then the handmade layer. It's a handmade image about a impersonally made image of a handmade image. So it's kind of like three layers of complexity. So that internal kind of complexity is often there with pop art between one thing and another, but sometimes it's more than even two layers, between high and low, between hot and cool. It's a very splashy, expressive, hot brushstroke represented in this cool, detached way. This one's from the Tate Gallery. It's a Wham, 1963. Well, one of his most famous images, a very large painting, a diptych, a two-panel painting, as you can see. A diptych, of course, is like a pre-modern format being referred to, and it works well in relation to the subject matter, because there's two parts of the subject. There's the plane, and then there's the plane that's the target of the rocket from that plane. So it makes sense to have it over two panels. It kind of fits thematically. You have that sense of some very hot subject matter presented in a cool, detached way. Handmade mimicking of mass reproduced imagery and comic book imagery, which is he's not the only artist to make use of it in the pop circle. We saw Hamilton using it in his what is it that makes today's home so different, so appealing? But he's certainly the one most associated with that. So comic books are, of course, it's kind of like a narrative sequence in a comic book, but he's just isolated one frame. So there's a sense of narrativity, but it's kind of broken down. We don't know the whole story. We don't know what happened before, what will happen after. So decontextualization. It's a kind of like a sort of freeze frame effect that you get because of that. Comic book, it's an idiom where you have words as well as imagery, so it's a way of introducing words into a visual image. We've seen that a lot in the 20th century already. Cubism liked to use typography, say the title of a newspaper collaged into a painting, or some stenciled words. Words as objects rather than words just for their meaning. And I feel that's part of what's going on here. He's asked about this, why are you using comic books, and someone asked him, do you transform the comic books when in your paintings? I suppose that behind that question is the idea, is there something original in what you're doing, or are you just parasitic over the art of the original comic book illustrator? And he picks up in his answer that word transformation. He said transformation is a strange word to use. It implies that art transforms. It doesn't. It just plain forms. Artists have never worked with the model, just with the painting. What you're really saying is that an artist like Cézanne transforms what we think the painting ought to look like into something he thinks it ought to look like. He's working with paint, not nature. He's making a painting. He's forming. I think my work is different from comic strips, but I wouldn't call it transformation. I don't think that whatever is meant by it is important to art. What I do is form, whereas the comic strip is not formed in the sense I'm using the word. Comics have shapes, but there has been no effort to make them intensely unified. The purpose is different. One intends to depict, and I intend to unify, and my work is actually different from comic strips in that every mark is really in a different place, however slight the difference seems to some. The difference is often not great, but it is crucial. So he's saying, yeah, I do change things around. I'm not just following my source material in a very servile way. And he's giving a kind of justification there for this art that's almost like a kind of formalistic justification. It's about the forming. It's not about the content. And there's a whole way of thinking about that, about pop art, that has tried to emphasize that, has said that, yeah, they're not that different from the abstract artists working at that time, that they're just concerned with form too, and we shouldn't pay too much attention to content. I think in his statement there, I think he's reacting against a certain position of the person asking the question. So maybe he's over-emphasizing form. This is one of the difficulties we have if we try as art historians to use artist statements, because statements are often situational. They're trying to respond to a particular feeling. They're working against a certain assumption, or trying to break down a certain assumption maybe. So a big kind of question that comes up really with pop art is, what is the attitude towards the subject matter? Since subject matter is so available, so much there, so decipherable compared to abstract expressionism, it's a sort of given, and we know the meaning because it comes from our everyday cultural space. What is the artist's attitude towards that? So here, taking a very hot subject, war, presenting it in a very cool way, is the artist being critical of warfare, or being critical of the way comic books present warfare? Certainly we're being given the opportunity to look carefully, more carefully than we would if we were reading a comic book, at how those things are happening. So it's a big question, and I think one of the important things in trying to answer it would be to say none of the pop artists tell you where they stand. It's in a way, it's the whole ambiguity is the important thing, in a way, not taking a clear-cut stance of saying what you mean. I think war is bad, or I'm very patriotic and I believe in shooting down the enemy's planes, or whatever it is, but they don't take those kind of sides in a situation where you might expect that sides should be taken. It's an issue everyone should have an opinion on, right? But they present it in this poker-faced, deadpan way of not telling you where they stand. So it's that sort of deliberate sort of absence of emotion over a very emotive topic. So yeah, again, very hot subject matter here. This is Drowning Girl, 1963. I don't care, I'd rather sink than call Brad for help. It's a sort of cliched kind of emotional idea, woman as passive. Again, you could say that, well, there's sort of a lot of gender politics here laid bare for looking at. But the image doesn't tell you how to interpret it. It just doesn't give you a clue. Some images are very rhetorically shaped, that they want to convey to you, please believe what I'm believing. But pop art is rarely like that. Maybe 1965. Maybe he became ill and couldn't leave the studio. So it's another one where it goes back to art about art, as a self-referential quality, but it's art about art via the comic book. Oh yeah, this is also, maybe it's like sort of could also be seen as reference to art, to this very minimalist kind of installations and things that are starting to come into existence at that time, a kind of empty room. I can see the whole room and there's nobody in it. We're looking in at a painting where someone's looking out at us. This is I Can See the Whole Room, 1961, so one of the earliest ones. Temple of Apollo, 1964. Yeah, again, art about art. High art, well, can't get much higher than a Greek temple, but it's very clearly via printed reproduction that reduces it even to the sort of very simple monochrome. And what is brought to mind is not just Greek temples, but the way people use, in a cliched way, references to classical culture. It could be, referring to something, a design on the decoration of the wall of a Greek restaurant or something like that, or even coffee cups, some sort of Greek designs on them and all sorts of things. So kind of interested in the kind of layering, which you don't get that in abstract expressionism, that sense of layering, of this sort of three-leveled sandwich of art and in the middle popular culture. But with pop art you're getting it a lot. And the interesting thing is where the different layers start to tangle and interfere with each other sometimes. Another example like that would be the Rouen Cathedral, 1969. It's a sequence of works where he's printing the same, creating the same image as if printed in different colours or something like that. Everything is tend to be handmade, but obviously it's after the work of Monet, his Rouen Cathedral, which was also made in a series, so he's mimicking the series-like quality of his source. Repetition is there in the source, but repetition, which we see in Andy Warhol's work as well, that's a typical kind of pop trait, and indeed in other artists' work of this time, minimalist work, for example, making use of repetition. But then here the dot-like printed technique, okay, it makes us think of the way art could be reproduced in a textbook or something like that, but it also makes us think of the dot-like touch. It's not exactly Monet's touch. Monet's touch is a broken touch, but it's a little bit more like the systematization of that touch that was done by Seurat in his neo-impressionist style, which, by the way, was partly influenced by looking at printing techniques, most people think. So that would be an example of how the different layers start to interfere and reference each other. Well, on to Andy Warhol, the most famous of pop artists. He actually started his career as an advertising artist, so when he engages with mass culture, including advertising culture, packaging design, you could say is the concern here, he's engaging with something that he knows very well. Those people who make those packaging, they are themselves artists. They may have trained in exactly the same art schools as the so-called high artists. Popular culture has a lower status, but the people who make that may be just as intelligent, just as skilled as the ones making high art. They may be more well trained, more intelligent. You know, they may have been to design school, unlike some of the bohemian artists of that era. You know, who may have had an anti-intellectual approach or something like that. You know. Well, the Campbell Soup Can. This is a 1961 version. That it's probably the most famous of Warhol's images, and it's very strongly associated with him. So he exhibited a whole series of canvases together, and making use of the fact, this sort of seriality quality of the original source material. That there's a kind of brand design, but then there are variations within it of the different flavors. So unity and diversity, or diversity as something, maybe, you know, if you want to see it as critical, you see it as a kind of critique of the superficial difference, customization, and that is put into products to give them an appeal nowadays. Yeah.
Do you know if the arrangement of the particular pieces on the wall was like Warhol's doing, or was it the museum's decision?
I don't know. You know, it was a gallery in LA, and they, you know, they're very smart guy who was running it, so he may well have had some part to play in deciding it. But I think it's clear it's meant to be that they should be put together. Somehow if you saw just one in isolation, it would have a lot less meaning. It's already having a kind of, there's a sort of installation quality already. Actually, the same is true though with Monet. You know, his original Rouen Cathedral works or Haystack series. There's a lot more meaning if you see them together, and you see the variations of time and day, and yet they've been split up around the world. Well, yeah, it's about consumption rather than production. You know, the shift from a world where everything is orientated to making, to a world where making maybe is sort of hidden away, but we're all concerned with consumer culture. You know, especially in our own time, that's the case, that making happens somewhere else. You know, maybe it happens in China, but you are consuming in America or something like that. Your job is not a factory job. You never make stuff. You just work in an office or something, and you just meet end products. In the era of the Model T Ford, you know, everything came off the production line looking the same. But in our own era, everything has to look different. You know, what color do you want it in? You know, what kind of extras do you want? We live in, you know, you want to just do something simple like buy some shampoo. You go into a Manning's or a Watson's or somewhere, and you'll find there's like 500 different kinds of shampoo. You know, it'd be simpler actually if there was only one or two or something like that. And is it a real freedom, a real choice that there are so many? Actually, how different are they in terms of their ingredients? Does it enrich your life? You know, we have a sense of consumer choice, but how important is all that? I think this kind of art is involved in some way in bringing those questions up. Slightly later down the road, coming back to the Campbell Soup Can in 1965, he's come back to kind of produce a sort of fold version where he's playing around with the original color scheme. So here again, like as I was talking about with Lichtenstein, it's like art about art. If you don't know about Fauvism and things like that, you may not know what is going on here. But you should know something about Campbell's soup cans as well. Here they're all tomato soup, so the variation is in the colouring. It's not in the design. In the contents. Do we buy the actual soup, or we buy because we like the packaging? It's always packaging is put in the foreground. We consume the packaging, if you like. This is back to 1962, 200 cans. So, yeah, he's solved that problem that the individual images might be bought by different people, and he's got 200 cans all together in one image, putting all the different varieties side by side. My own personal insight into this, for all it's worth, is that Andy Warhol grew up in Pittsburgh, and if you've ever gone to Pittsburgh, you'll know it's a city where soup is made, because it's the city of the company Heinz. Actually, there are two main soup brands in America. One is Campbell's, the other is Heinz. Campbell's is from New Jersey. Heinz is from Andy Warhol's home city of Pittsburgh. Everywhere you go in Pittsburgh, you'll see this is the Heinz Auditorium, this way to the Heinz, whatever. So it's kind of strange to me that he's deliberately not using the brand that is so associated with his hometown, but is using a brand that's associated with New Jersey. Well, of course, that's near to New York, where he moved to, but it's a sort of rejection of roots, if you want to put it that way. Apparently, his mum used to make little kind of objects to sell out of these kind of cans and things like that. So he has some personal association, but that's not really something that we can be aware of when we're looking at the works themselves. We don't know about that. But when you put so many together here in one image, then it starts to become almost like an abstract design. In a way, it becomes comparable to the grid-like structures of some abstract art. So we can make comparisons. Artists of very different styles. They may nevertheless go to the same school. They may have studios in the same building. They may be friends who go for a beer together. It could be that artists that look very different may come from a very similar situation. So yeah, there could be similarities even across quite big disparities of style. The Brilla boxes, 1964, again very iconic image of Andy Warhol. Sort of equivalent to the Campbell Soup cans, but in 3D, making a version as a 3D object, where there's the ambiguity between it. It looks pretty similar to the actual cartons. In this case, it's not so much how an object is displayed to the consumer. The can design is made to appeal to the consumer, and even the sort of mass presentation of them is a little bit like the display techniques you might get in a shop. How do you display it if you run a shop in such a way that you'll make it attractive to the buyer? Sometimes you might have the manager might say, well, let's have a big display where we have all the different, something like that. But this is more the way in which they come to the shop itself. It's not how the end consumer would see it. It's the big box in which you would then open up, and you'd have the smaller packages which individually are sold to consumers. And then somewhere in the back of the store, you compact all your cardboard, that you'd that it come in order to recycle. I think it's worth, when we start to look at minimalism, to remember a work like this, very simple forms presented. There is some parallels. His Mao from 1972. That image of Mao, it's really the image of Mao from the Little Red Book, the preface or foreword of the Little Red Book, which is, one of the most, the largest circulating books that have been published in the last 100 years. And therefore that image is one of the most reproduced portraits ever as well, you could say. So if you're interested in mass reproduction, this would be a kind of archetypal case to engage with. So even if you're in the States, you'll be very aware of Mao's image. I remember getting my copy of the Little Red Book in, I think it was in one of the London street markets anyway. But you could write away to the Chinese embassy, they'd send you one free. So everyone had seen them. Yeah.
I was just going to ask about how this image was made. It doesn't look like a screen print. Is it a paint?
I think there is screen print, and then there is some paint as well. So he's very interested in screen print, which I think probably comes as much as anything from Rauschenberg, as a kind of, it's in between it's a sort of semi-automating method, but it still involves the hand. So it's kind of got this kind of in-between status, which I think works well for appropriating imagery and referencing mass reproduction techniques. Even in your technique of production, you're sort of relating to it, but you've got a distance from it as well. But I think he wants to have this kind of brushed, individualized look as well. In the same way as Lichtenstein wants to reference the brushwork of abstract expressionism, I think that's the sort of thing that comes up to mind here, is that very spontaneous brushwork of other kinds of painting, which is so at odds with the mass reproduced image. And yet here, it doesn't really carry that any kind of expressive interiority to it. The brushwork is just a quotation of brushwork, it seems, as much as in the Lichtenstein work. That's how I would read it. So it's a bringing of two things together, the mass reproduced and the individualized. Or it makes me think of customization, the faked way consumer products are made to seem different, one from another, when actually they're not that different really. They just give some superficial kind of way of on the surface making them look as if some hand attention has been given to each one. Hand finished is a kind of terminology perhaps for that. So yeah, there's a deliberate sort of clashing between the kind of the handmade marks and the mass reproduced marks, the kind of screen. The screen print can have a certain irregularity of application of paint as well. It's a pigment as well, depending on how you're using it, of course. One screen print can be quite different from another, even though you're using the same template. That's just up to you how you want to do it. So it's not just products which are sold through imagery, popular mass reproduced imagery. It's also political power that grows. How did Mao gain his power? It's partly by the sort of mass dissemination of his writing and his images and so forth. So it's a reference to those kind of processes and a kind of deconstruction of them in some way. Marilyn. This is 1967 version. Of course, Marilyn wasn't her real name. Marilyn Monroe was her stage name, so originally she's Norma Jean. So there's already a kind of layer of fabrication, and then this is not a portrait of Marilyn, let alone of Norma Jean. It's Marilyn as she appeared in a still for the film Niagara or something, I think, you know. There's various and film stills are a funny thing, because a film still is not like a screenshot, something you've caught from the film. It's kind of a still photography made at the same time as the film for publicity for it. So there's all these kind of levels of artificiality involved, and you know, he plays up that artificiality by kind of adding on the kind of an extra layers of paint. It's almost like the application of makeup, lipstick or eye makeup, to, you know, this, to give you a sense that you're only dealing with surfaces. There's no depth here. Everything is kind of flat or empty.
Is it
Yeah.
painted or print?
It's using silk screen. Yeah. So that I think there would always be some painting going on, but I think silk screen is the main method.
So it's not handmade.
It is handmade, yeah. It's not done by a machine,
Okay.
but a silk screen would be a method of photographically taking an existing image, but then you put pigment on and you rub it through a kind of a grid, if you want to call it that, onto your surface. Yeah. So each one will come out slightly different. It's almost like a printmaking technique. I remember that de Kooning has already been interested in Marilyn Monroe as a media figure. This is all something of that era. It's the era of where film is really very powerful as a medium. It's at the growing edge of technology, you could say. Massive numbers of people are going to movies all the time. It's a major form of dating, apart from anything else, is to a boy and a girl go to see a movie or that kind of thing. So all sorts of importance of these figures, and it's a kind of celebrity that maybe didn't exist in earlier eras in quite the same way, that is a product of mass reproduction of imagery. Golde, Marilyn Monroe, 1962. So he'll often take an image and make different variations of it. Repetition with variations, play around with the different ideas. Putting her against the gold background, it maybe recalls orthodox icons. He himself comes from a kind of Catholic background, but in the orthodox Eastern Christian churches, there is this idea of the icon, and often a figure against an empty gold background gives a sort of celestial environment. So playing with the idea as if she is a sort of god, literally a goddess or something, not just a screen goddess. Of course, Marilyn Monroe died tragically young, and quite a few of the images of human figures, particular portrait figures that Andy Warhol engages with, are figures of people who have died. So you could say death becomes one of the subjects of his art. this is the Russian artist Kozolapov, Gorby, with an image of Gorbachev that kind of takes the same model that deliberately mimicking Warhol's Golde, Marilyn Monroe, and of course then he's taking it back to a culture where these orthodox icons are understood. And the Russian artist did this a little bit before the Chinese artists, but we see this happening in China too, the appropriation of pop art for a politicized project. Ethel Scarl, well, she was kind of the wife of, was a husband and wife team that were collecting art and were buying this kind of new art. They were sort of nouveau riche collectors, you could say. They had a taxi company, I think. They made a load of money and then they started buying this art. It's not like the kind of very cultured, educated kind of collectors of a different era. Things are changing. And she wanted an Andy Warhol portrait, so he took her to a photo booth, one of those automatic photo booths, and just fed coins in while she sat there, got lots and lots of different portraits of her in slightly different poses, and then put them all together to make this portrait. So again, it's playing with a certain mode of imagery, the photo taken by a machine, which is a modern phenomenon. He's getting her to put her sunglasses on, so she's kind of hiding herself as much as revealing herself. A portrait is meant to reveal, but sunglasses sort of hide you. Diamond Dust Shoes. This is from 1980. So actually using this sort of glitter on the surface of the painting itself. Shoes is one of the many items he had to try and sell when he was working as himself as a younger man, as making advertising images. This is a very famous comparison made by the theorist Frederick Jameson between Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust Shoes and the Van Gogh boots, to talk about a difference between modernism and postmodernism, something like that. Of course, there is also irony even in that era. You take someone like Oscar Wilde, who's very ironic and distant. It's not something that just belongs to our own era. Yeah, this is the kind of lovely little quirky drawings he made of individual shoes, when he was working as a younger man. Advertising imagery, really. 30 are better than one, 1963. Well, it's his engagement with the Mona Lisa. I suppose the Mona Lisa, it's a work of art, a work of high art, but it's also a work of high art that sort of stands for art in general. It's become a kind of signifier of art. And, talking about, well, it's also an artwork that became very famous, partly because it was stolen. It has this sort of interesting life history. It was stolen and then came back. So it's almost like an artwork you read about it in the like reading about a star's private life in a tabloid press or something like that. People would read stories about the private life of this painting, that it got stolen and came back, and then it became famous as a result. So by mass reproducing it, it's giving you a sense of how do we meet these works of art nowadays? We meet them as reproductions. If we're so lucky as to see the original, then even that will be somehow infected by the sense of being finally I'm seeing the original Mona Lisa after all these years of just seeing the reproductions. You have a sense of being in the presence of the original of the reproductions, which would not have been a pre-modern experience. It's very much an experience of our own era. The German critic Walter Benjamin talked about how mass reproduction could maybe destroy the aura of a handmade original work of art. But maybe that doesn't actually happen. Maybe mass reproduction could increase the sense of aura. Anyway, the handmade work of art still has a role. Pop art is saying, I think, that it has a role to critique all these things, mass reproduction. Remember, of course, Duchamp had already been interested in the Mona Lisa, La Shōoku, so he had brought it into the world of high art. And Andy Warhol, even though Andy Warhol isn't referencing Duchamp, nevertheless Duchamp comes in here, because Duchamp is also using a reproduction. Well, there are other artists as well who played around with her. So this is Malevich, in the early 20th century Russian artist, before he became completely abstract. He used her cancelled within one of his, as a collaged element. Again, it's the reproduction, of course. Oh, and this is what you experience if you go to see the actual Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa would be over here somewhere. You see loads of people taking photos, often with flash, which they're not meant to be doing. And the sense of the fame, it's like you're coming into the presence of a celebrity. Let's all crowd round and see how close we can get to the celebrity. This is Rauschenberg, his Pneumonia Lisa. So this is kind of like a new Mona Lisa, something like that, punning. Pneumonia is a disease of the chest, so it's kind of like he's playing around with her chest. That's 1982, so it's off, although Rauschenberg is sort of an influence on Andy Warhol, starts before him. This one is actually after Andy Warhol's engagement with Mona Lisa. Often he's taking these again, it's very sort of hot imagery. It's an electric chair, a chair used for execution. Still, even today in the United States, they have the death penalty. So again, a very hot topic, but presented in this cool way. And the colour, the colour is sort of deliberately inappropriate in a way for such a serious topic. It doesn't help convey the right mood. It's not an expressive kind of colour anyway. Like this is, I'm sorry the colour's not come out very well in the projection, but this is a sort of lavender colour. And he references these in the title, Orange Disaster, Lavender Disaster. Lavender's sort of like a kind of very inappropriate kind of colour for image of an electric chair, of cold-blooded killing. There's a deliberate sort of clashing. Red Race Riot. Is it more effective to present it in a very deadpan way than if you were to say, oh, I think it's terrible, or the racial discrimination in our country or something like that. Instead of saying where you stand, you just sort of present it coolly, detachedly. I mean, Andy Warhol himself makes things more difficult to follow. You know, you can't say whether he I mean, if he's asked about his own art, he often doesn't claim any kind of critical distance at all. He says, often speaks in this very naive voice, like, I think everybody should like everybody, you know. Or asked why he started painting the soup cans. He says, because I used to drink it. I used to have the same lunch every day for 20 years, I guess, the same thing over and over again. So it's just sort of giving sort of like some simple biographical explanation. Or his pop art is a sort of just a liking of things. Occasionally he'll give a clue, like he says, when you see a gruesome picture over and over again, it doesn't really have any effect. So this sort of repetition of images of something terrible, to talk about that process of anesthetization. Why do we let such terrible things happen in our world and we don't do something about it? Maybe we're just overexposed to it. We can't. There's the phrase compassion fatigue, you know. Or is a peculiar experience that someone 100 years ago would never have had, that you're sitting down eating your evening meal and watching some horrible disaster on the evening news of your TV, but you carry on eating your evening meal. I mean, that's kind of, we've all had that kind of experience. But 100 years ago, people would not have had that kind of experience. It could be the disaster is happening live, you know, right now people are dying or something, but, well, yeah, I'm finishing my dinner, you know. That's that kind of weird detached feeling that modern life has. And yeah, it's interesting for artists to try and specify all that, the strangeness of it, recover the strangeness of it all. Money, yeah. Well, you know, ultimately is the kind of the thing that people believe in the most in the modern world is money, yeah. But what is? It's just something that's mass reproduced. It's just a kind of a symbol, a sign, something. There's no intrinsic value to currency. It's just we choose to believe in it. Selling images of dollar signs to rich collectors, you know. Or, if you like, sell them images of hammers and sickles, of communist symbols, again, for lots of money to your rich collectors. When he went to he came to Hong Kong, and I know someone who met him, and he went into mainland China. He went to the Great Wall, of course, and things like that. And there's a bit of movie of that that's available of Andy Warhol in China, and some artist makes in front of him a ink painting, performs an ink painting, and signs it for him, gives it to him, and then he does the same thing back. He makes an image to give to that artist, and his image is a dollar sign. And then he writes fortune, you know, which is, you know, kind of like something positive, you know, good fortune or something. But it's also crass materialism at the same time. Oxidation Painting, 1978. Well, this sort of fits in with this sort of the critique of abstract expressionism. It's a painting made by urination onto a surface that will chemically change as a result, and then kind of record that process. So it's process art, if you like, which becomes quite popular in this era, but in a very deconstructive way. It's a little bit like a kind of footnote to Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock also poured liquid down onto a surface that was on the ground to create abstract images. So Andy Warhol is in his own way pouring liquid down. Okay, let's take our break now.